But where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. The deep says, "It is not with me," and the sea says, "It is not with me." It cannot be purchased for gold, nor can silver be weighed for its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, in precious onyx or sapphire. Neither gold nor crystal can equal it, nor can it be exchanged for jewelry of fine gold. No mention shall be made of coral or quartz, for the price of wisdom is above rubies. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. These are the words of Job. Thank you for joining His Generation podcast. You're listening to His Generation podcast, a weekly exploration into biblical truth as we explore the Word of God. His Generation podcast airs every Sunday morning, so grab your Bible, and here we go. As a reminder, the book of Job is wisdom literature. And in the exploration of wisdom literature, you're always going to find that it's going to equal a point to where we find wisdom in whatever's going on. And so today, what I want to look at is the wisdom that Job is going to glean as he comes to somewhat of a summary of his trial, his time of misery, his time of suffering. And that's what we want to see today. I read from Job chapter 28, and in Job chapter 28, what we find there is that Job starts to discourse on this poetic appeal to wisdom, because he understands that there is wisdom that is contained in this moment of suffering. He can't find it in his friends, obviously, as his friends try to comfort him in the midst of his misery. But what he does is he has a heart cry out to the Lord to figure out what is wisdom, or what is the wisdom in this situation. In fact, I would say there in verse 28 of 28, that where he concludes, that is Job, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding." That's a very strong statement in the midst of where Job is at right now in chapter 28, because he has debated over and over again with his friends. His friends they suspect that Job has some kind of secret sin of some sort, because according to their theology, God only punishes the wicked, and everything that's happening to Job at this point seems peak wicked because he has lost everything to the extent of his own children. But Job, again, maintains his innocence as I've done no secret sin. In fact, I've done everything opposite of sin to maintain favor with God, right? That's his theology. I got to remain favor with God. But what we're going to find as we start to conclude to the final chapters here of Job, that neither Job was right nor his friends were right, because they both had a mixture of not really understanding what God was doing in the midst of this. But Job is on the right track, because Job, towards the end, has now come to a point of crying out for wisdom, asking for wisdom. It sounds very familiar, because that's a lesson that we learn also from the New Testament apostles. As we look into the book of James, for instance, James says there in James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, he says, "If any one of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives it to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." And that's a very observational truth right there. God does give out wisdom very liberally. But you got to ask in faith, understanding that wisdom is not going to come from yourself, but it is going to come from God, who is the originator of it and the master of it. In fact, the book of Proverbs also talks about God, the Holy Spirit, operating in that wisdom when creation was coming about. So there is this idea that wisdom originates from God himself. And then when one wants wisdom, they need to go to ask God, but they need to have the faith that it's God who and only who they can receive it from, and also whom they will also be able to obtain it. Like, it will happen. It's not something that's not going to happen. And that's the idea. The double-minded man doesn't think that. The double-minded man has one idea in the world. Well, I can get wisdom from the world, and I can get a little wisdom from God. And then I can mix them and I can make my own conclusions. That's not so. And as we see there in the book of Job, we're going to also see that he, right, starts to come to those conclusions where we start to see his faith. He is not double-minded. In fact, he says there in chapter 28, like I said before, he makes that very bold statement, behold, the fear of the Lord. That is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. Both two things that Job has practiced all his life. And when it comes down to the end of his suffering here, he's going to continue to practice those things. But here's the encouragement, saints. Here is the application. Let me do a sneak peek. Here's the application to today's reading. It is a learning process. And that's what Job had to go through to learn this. God's intent for Job was that he would have the best of God, right? God's intent was to pour favor on Job, but it wasn't because of Job necessarily earned that favor. Just God decided to put that favor upon Job. And when God the Father decides to put that favor upon his child, he is going to instruct him and bring him through those seasons to fulfill those things. Ultimately, why? Because he loves us, right? But ultimately, why? It's for his glory, because the glory always comes back to God. And that's where it needs to be. It needs to be with God. He is the originator of all things. In this case, he's the originator of wisdom. And of course, he's the originator of Job's faith. And in Job's faith, he makes that statement, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. Because if we go into the Proverbs, which is more wisdom literature, we understand there, right, that the fool doesn't want any kind of wisdom whatsoever. We have a lot of contrast of the wise and the fools. We go to the book of Proverbs, but sometimes we don't realize that the fool is one that is not teachable. He or she has no desire for God or for learning wisdom from God. That is the fool. So to make a statement like what Job made in chapter 28, he is not of the fool. Thus, he is on the road to learning that wisdom. And this suffering is part of that learning process. So let's go into Job chapter 29 and let's read a little bit of Job as he's coming to that understanding of what is the summary of what God's trying to teach me and what I should learn. That's what Job is going through. So let's read together and find out. Chapter 29. Job further continued his discourse and said, "Oh, that I were as in past months, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness, just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, and when my children were around me." Now that's a powerful statement because we understand that Job's children have passed away. And so we need to remember that. We always got to bring context to these words that are coming out of Job's mouth. These are heartfelt words. Now, there is an incorrect theology within that because he believes that God has departed from him, but God has not departed from him. Just because in the days of plentiful, or should I say this because this is where we're going to get at for the wisdom, the abounding days is not the only time that God is with somebody. And that's where Job was off in his understanding. But God's faithful, and God will show him. When my steps were bathed with cream, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me, when I went out to the gate by the city, when I took my seat in the open square, the young men saw me and hid, and the aged men arose and stood. So he received a lot of respect because he was an elder that had a righteous character. That's the idea behind it. The princes refrained from talking and put their hand over their mouth. The voice of nobles were hushed, and their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard, then it blessed me. And when the eye saw, then it approved me. Because I delivered the poor who cried out, the fatherless, and the one who had no helper. The blessing of a perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind, and I was feet to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and I searched out the case that I did not know. I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. Then I said, I shall die in my nest and multiply my days as the sand. My root is spread out to the waters, and the dew lies all night at my branch. My glory is fresh within me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. Men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel. After my words, they did not speak again, and my speech settled as dew. They waited for me as for the rain, and they opened their mouth wide as for the spring rain. If I mocked at them, they did not believe it. At the light of my countenance, they did not cast down. I chose the way for them, and I sat as chief. So I dwelt as a king in the army, as one who comforts the mourners. So as Job reflects upon his days, there's a couple of things that come to surface in this portion of discourse. First of all, I mentioned before, his children. He mentions those things. But also, too, the second part, his position in society. His position in society was one that was well respected. Not respected because they necessarily feared him, like he was someone of, great size and, combat abilities or weaponry of some sort, or he held an army behind him. They didn't fear him that way. What they respected him and because he was an honorable person that always had the cause of righteousness. That's why he says, I put on righteousness and it clothed me, because he always had the cause of righteousness. He was always looking for the widow to help out, always looking for the victim that was being oppressed, always looking for be the voice of the voiceless and to be the legs for the lame and the eyes for the blind. Those are all very poetic ways of saying those in society that were suffering because of obvious reasons, like obvious physical reasons that they're out of their control. He was their advocate. He was the one. Because of that, the rest of society looked upon him and upon his broad shoulders, figuratively, because he was holding a lot of responsibility as a leader. That's what they were looking at. And so that's why he would say at the very end, so I dwelt as a king in the army. That's a very high leadership role, as we know in most governments and most societies. But, and here's the big but, when we get into chapter 30, this is where it's come to. So here, the first part I would label as the abounding. That's where we abound at that point. Job was abounding, and he saw the favor of God upon him, and he saw the repercussions of him practicing the righteousness of God in society. So he goes on to say in Job 30, but now they mock me, men younger than I, whose fathers I disdained to put with the dogs of my flock. Indeed, What profit is the strength of their hands to me? Their vigor has perished. They are gaunt from want and famine, fleeing late to the wilderness, desolate and waste, who pluck marlow by the bushes and broom tree roots for their food. They were driven out from among men. They shouted at them as at a thief. They had to live in the clefts of the valleys, in the caves of the earth and the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they nestled. They were sons of fools, yes, sons of vile men. They were scourged from the land, and now I am their taunty song. Yes, I am their byword. They abhor me. They keep far from me. They do not hesitate to spit in my face, because he has loosed my bowstring and afflicted me. They have cast off restraint before me. At my right hand, the rabble rises. They push away my feet, and they rise against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come as broad breakers. Under the ruinous storm, they roll along. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed like a cloud. And now my soul is poured out because of my plight. The days of affliction take hold of me. My bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pains take no rest. But great force, my garment is disfigured. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. He has cast me into the mire, and I become like dust and ashes. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up, and you regard me. But you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand, you oppose me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride on it. You spoil my success. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. Surely he would not stretch out his hand against a heap of ruins if they cry out when he destroys it. Have I not wept for him who was in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came to me. And when I waited for light, then came darkness. My heart is in turmoil and cannot rest. Days of affliction comfort me. I go about mourning, but not in the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry out for help. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever. My harp is turned to mourning, and my flute to the voice of those who weep. So it's very poetic, but we get the point. The point is, Job's in the most miserable state, and that most miserable state is recognized because he has an oppositional picture of what it looks like not to be miserable, right? He lived a life of many years of not this misery. In fact, his confusion also is, and part of his statement at that point is that Job himself had been one to help people in those points of misery. You know, he's been one that's looked at the fathers of these sons who are miserable, and he's found some kind of position in society for them. And he's also defended, like he said before, defended those that were oppressed or those that were in severe suffering and trouble. He would help those. And now it's gone so far in his misery that not even any of those that he helped would even help him in this matter, is what you hear in his complaint. And so he finally appeals to God and says, I know you will take me, but I know you'll at least have some kind of mercy on me, right? And so he's hoping in the very last, when, his soul is taken, that at least you'll hear him out as he's going to the grave. That's kind of what he's saying. If I could summarize all that poetry and all that literature into something that's a little more literal. And so that's what he says there. So Job is coming to a conclusion that we've all come to at some point in our Christian walk. And it's nothing that's new. I'm not sharing anything that's new under the sun. This is not new revelation. There's no such thing as new revelation. It's all been summarized in the Bible. You just have to look for it and to see where these lessons of value are all littered throughout, especially in the New Testament. I look at the New Testament writers, especially the apostles, and go, wow, how did they get this? Well, obviously by faith, I believe that it's inspired, that the words that they wrote are inspired. But also too, I understand that the prophets of old who wrote the majority of the Old Testament, they were taught the same things that the New Testament writers in Christ have now come to understand. It's just in the revelation through Christ, there's more clarity, and so they can get to the point. They don't need to write 42 chapters of Job to understand a very simple truth. They could just get to the point because of through the revelation of Christ. And Paul the Apostle was one that got straight to that point. Paul the Apostle writes this in Philippians, and this is the point that I want to make for today's application. He wrote in Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13 this: "But I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now, at last, your care for me has flourished again. Though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regard to need," and here's the wisdom, "for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content." There's the simplicity of it. So in context, Paul is talking to the Philippian church of how they have given financially to him to help him with his needs and help those and his companions as they go spread the gospel throughout the Asian Minor region, right? And so he's telling them, thank you for those gifts, but it's not about the gifts. In fact, if you look at the majority of Philippians, the place that he would want them to abound in, as he's going to talk here in the text, is love. Now, a reflection of that love is the giving, obviously, but regardless, Paul is sharing them this jewel of wisdom, because we understand that wisdom is more precious than rubies. So this jewel of wisdom, and that is, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Further, he says this: I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full and to be hungry. So there's your balance, full and hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Why? For him, like I said, because of the revelation of Christ, he didn't have to go through 42 chapters of suffering like Job did, right? Because what did Job say in chapter 19 of Job? He was looking towards a Redeemer. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and I will stand with him on that day, he would say there in Job chapter 19. So the revelation of Christ was to be looked forward to, but it still was dim. It wasn't clear. It wasn't until Christ came. And here we have the apostles writing that they see there, because this whole lesson that Paul had learned in Philippians was because he says there at the very end, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The revelation of Christ made it mainstream of that simple truth. I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. There it is. That's it. That's it. And we had hints of those wisdoms as we go through, for instance, like the most explicit wisdom literature, and that's the book of Proverbs. In fact, it says there, I think in Proverbs 30, verses 7 through 9, listen what the writer of Proverbs says there. He says, 2 things I request of you, speaking to the Lord: deprive me not before I die. Remove falsehood and lies from me, and give me neither poverty nor riches. That's interesting. Why? What's the wisdom? He says this, feed me with the food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you, and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and still and profane the name of the Lord. Because this person understood wisdom, and he understood that there is this time to abound and there's this time to abase. And sometimes we have to go through those seasons to learn those things, right? So he's gonna go cut to the chase and just say this, hey, you know what? Never give me too much so that, I lose heart, or I think that it's the substance that is the blessing from you, right? Nor never make me so poor that I do something unrighteous, like steal. Because when a man is hungry, he'll do some desperate things. He understood that about his own nature here. So the wisdom is this: balance. Give me balance. And that's that idea where Paul the Apostle, for instance, says, I've learned to be content. Content is what I would, in my opinion, make it equal to, in this case, when it comes to this type of wisdom, balance. Balance. So Job, we see there, comes to a place of balance. Because what we're going to find in the next following chapters, he's going to further talk about how, and I think at this point he's just defending himself to the Lord in general, because then we see in the later chapters that the Lord actually responds to him and to a lot of these misstatements that he makes. So what we see in the next chapter is Job starts to point out, how he's been righteous, when he's fed the poor, when he's, been obedient in all ways of righteousness and things like that, to further show that he's never been in sin. It was never a sin issue. So that's okay, because he's getting it. He's getting it. It wasn't his sin that brought him this suffering. It was just an act of God, because God is faithful to bring Job into understanding, right? Job did his part by departing from evil, right? Because he says there, to depart from evil is understanding. Now the second part, to fear the Lord, that is wisdom. And so those two things come to a combination in the life lesson of Job. In his abounding, he understood it. He did well. But now here comes the second part of the test. What about in your abase? Can you learn to be content in that too, Job? Well, I'll give you a sneak peek, because as we get to the final chapters of Job, in Job chapter 42, I believe. Job chapter 42, it says there in verse 16, after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. So Job died old and full of days. So Job did eventually die. We all eventually die. But he didn't die in the miserable state that he thought he was being punished in. No, God had a plan for him. God had a plan for him. And God has a plan for you, and God has a plan for me. So my advice, the lesson from all this, embrace the wisdom that we have to come to as we go through trials, because there is wisdom to be learned there. But going back to the Apostle James and his writing, don't ask with double-mindedness. Ask in faith and be patient as God delivers that lesson of wisdom in your life. Thank you. This has been His Generation Podcast.
Thank you for joining us at His Generation Podcast. To receive more information about the podcast, please visit our website, hisgeneration.net, or check out our YouTube channel, His Generation Podcast, for the video format of this broadcast. His Generation is a production of Generation Mars Media, located in Orange County, California.